is an anthropologist and researcher at the CNRS and co-director of the Laboratoire d'Anthropologie Politique. She works on deportees, grassroots movements in Africa, on the history of refugee camps in relation to migration control, and on refugees' political organization inside camps. She is the author of Le Manifeste de Expelled, as well as the forthcoming book, L'Exposé Sujet Politique. She also co-edited Un Monde des Camps with Michel Agier, and with Jean-Frédéric Duasque, she edited Après le Camp. Salvador Rangel is an assistant professor of sociology at Swarthmore College. He is a formerly undocumented migrant who became an academic after many years of working in the construction, textile, and other so-called non-skilled sectors. His work deals with race, migration, political economy, and the way they are interconnected with capitalism. He's currently working on a book manuscript preliminarily titled La Jungla, Migrant Labor, Globalization, and the Meatpacking Industry. So thank you both so much for being here. I'm going to start with a broad question that you both can respond to, which is just to ask you to please give us a brief overview of your respective intellectual trajectories and how you arrived at the research that you've shared with us. And also, do you have any other current research projects that you'd like to mention?
Okay, I can start. I can turn this on first, right? Is that good? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I always kind of like to say that I became an academic by accident. I really was a labor migrant. I didn't come to the U.S. I didn't go to the U.S. for the purpose of education. I went to work, as many people have done before me, from Mexico, from my hometown, from my state of Guanajuato. My father, my uncle, they both migrated before me. There's a long history of migration from my home state. There's this story that I often like to tell about, how much this is in case the fact, right, that so much migration has been happening from these places. That when I was a kid, I was a mama's boy. I used to hang out with my mom all the time in the kitchen. I still didn't learn how to cook, even hanging out with her all the time. But I used to annoy the crap out of her because she was always cooking. I'm always getting their food. And one time she got annoyed with me and she told me, in Spanish, she said, "Muchacho, why don't you go and get a job?" I must have been like 5 or 6 years old. In English, she said, "Boy, why don't you go and get a job, right?" And so I said, "Well, tell me where the north is." This was my answer. Dígame dónde está el norte.
Yes, speak a little louder.
Yeah.
Because, even at that age, I was quite familiar that as soon as you became of age, you went to the north to work, right? To me, the north was just a destination. It wasn't a cardinal direction. It was a place in which grown men went to get jobs, right? And so this is kind of what has been informing my academic research and my trajectory. The questions I seek to answer, the perspectives that I take are informed by that background. And this is important because there has been a lot of moments of awakening in that process, right? So one of the very first moments that I recall thinking about these things is when I was, in fact, crossing the border and becoming detained by the Border Patrol. And realizing that, contrary to what I might have thought about, we're Latino, we're Mexicans, right? Because you don't think you're Latino when you live in your home state. You think you're whatever that happens to be, Mexican, Colombian. And so I saw that most of the Border Patrol were actually Mexicans. And so when they detained me and took me to the detention center, I was just kind of surprised. I was shocked. Because like, you are one of us. How come you're doing this to us, right? I couldn't understand it. But in fact, they really weren't one of us. They were working for the state. And that is not to put the blame on them. That is just to understand that they were constrained by their choices, that they had to get jobs in whatever they could get jobs. And if you live in the border states, close to the border, that often ends up being working for the Border Patrol, right? Same happens with the military, those kinds of things. And so it was a moment of realization in which I, perhaps you begin thinking about things critically in terms of race. The phrase from Stuart Hall and his colleagues in Policing the Crisis comes to mind, and race is the modality in which classes live. So I thought about that, right? But then pretty soon I was like, well, it's not necessarily just about race, because there's something else at play here, right? These people are, I thought, my people, but they don't think that's the case. Anyway, so I then joined the textile industry for a couple of years in North Carolina. worked in construction for about 5 years. And all this time, I was going to ESL classes, trying to learn English better, and you know, I knew some English already, you know, coming from Mexico. But at some point, I maxed that out. I took all the classes I could take in ESL classes, you know, and I was like, what am I going to do? So let me go to community college and see what I can do there, and take some of the, you know, English 101 and so on and so forth. This was in Kentucky, by the way. You know, we like to make fun of Kentucky as a backward state, but at this point in time, this is the mid-2000s, is one of the few states in which if you had an in-state degree, including a GED, which I had obtained by that point, you could attend the in-state college and pay in-state tuition. So I started going to community college, took all these classes, sociology, anthropology, psychology, they all kind of spoke to me. And yeah, eventually it just kind of became a matter of path dependence. I just kept studying, kept, you know, getting interested in further things and getting some initial answers to the things that I was interested in. And particularly with the Marxist theory, that has been the case for me. You know, Marxist theory really has provided me the ability to ask the questions that I need to have answers for, right? So I remember sitting in classes, we were discussing the works of Wallerstein and, you know, world systems theory. You're familiar with that kind of body of work. And thinking, well, actually, this makes sense, you know, based on my trajectory to that point and seeing the kind of people that I was working side by side and seeing how this model of periphery, semi-periphery core, you know, it actually made sense to the reality that I had lived up until that point, right? And so I really began to get engaged with Marxist theory at that point, and just happened to be lucky enough to work with some great Marxists throughout my time in education. And so that's kind of how I began to ask these questions and thinking about these things in a more critical way and thinking about, well, if it's not race, then what is it? And getting interested in class politics, class analysis. Then if I say that I became an academic accidentally, I would say that I became a sociologist by necessity, because I had to choose something, right? It's not that sociology is the most exciting thing to me, but that I thought that at that point, I mean, it gave me the sort of breathing room to be able to ask different questions and look at different parts to answer those questions, right? And so, yeah, I started, but you know, this is to say that I'm not satisfied with being a sociologist, because I think these disciplines really become straitjackets for the analysis that we need to develop, right? So the most interesting areas of research and analysis that I have encountered are really beyond the disciplinary boundaries of anything. So in my work, I end up mostly studying anthropologists, geographers, historians. Sociologists have become really kind of interested in doing demographics, demographic analysis, these kinds of things. And there's almost an aversion to Marxist analysis, right? And so I would say that this is how I became interested in these things and became, in fact, a Marxist over time and learned to ask these kinds of questions. I will talk about this later, but the dialectical analysis of Marx's approach has really become a hallmark of my analysis, and I don't think I would be able to do the kind of work that I do without that. It really has become paramount. So maybe I'll leave that there for now, but I'll be happy to come back to these things in a minute.
First, thanks a lot, Jennifer and Gabriel, for the invitation. I'm very honored. And you will have to excuse me, but I'm not so good in English to improvise, so I will mostly read my answers. So I was trained in philosophy and psychology before doing a PhD in social anthropology. And if I look back at the start of my studies, I think I was always interested by the intertwining between forms of social segregation and discrimination and the ways people react, develop self-agency, and eventually resist to them. In my 20s, I worked, for example, on the archives of the Groupe Information Prison Information Group, I would say, a collective that was formed by Foucault and other intellectuals in the 1970s in order to collect information and knowledge about the infamous conditions in French prisons in a time of revolt and mutiny. I was interested by the aim of the collective, which was at some point to create conditions for the detainees to speak out about their condition and the general system of imprisonment. And also, I was very interested by the way this movement nourished Foucault's reflection on the history of disciplinary power. I worked also on the role of physical stigmas in the birth of criminal anthropology and on the relationship between physical characteristics and the social construction of the criminal. I was certainly influenced on a human and intellectual level by Rangel and Baliba, that we share as teachers with Gabriel, who were my teachers and supervisors in my master's years. And I guess in working on frontiers, deportation, and political subjectivity these last 15 years, I have more or less consciously integrated their works to the development of my own research. And I sometimes both feel very indebted to them and not really emancipated somehow. In 2007, I started to work on deportees grassroots movements in Africa after I found out about the existence of the Malian Deportees Association, Association Malienne des Expulsés, an association which was created in 1996 in Bamako by deportees who wanted to share their hardships and create the conditions of a solidarity and self-help among deportees. This research aimed to fill a gap in the field of migration studies where there is an enormous imbalance between the number of studies dealing with the processes of control, surveillance, imprisonment and expulsion, and the rarity of studies exploring the fate of deportees and the social and political consequences of deportation policies on the societies and countries of origin. I progressively got astonished by the way migration studies mimic and reproduce imbalance of powers between geographical and political spaces, and how the omission of the deportees in migration studies was some sort of continuity to the way deporting countries make foreigners literally disappear politically once they have been removed. In parallel to my work on deportees versus movements, I got interested initially through a book I co-edited with the anthropologist Michel Agier to the process of politicization among refugees inside camps. In the same vein as my work on deportees movements, refugees politicization inside camps is some sort of a blind spot, both of the UNHCR institutional narrative on refugee camps and of refugee studies themselves, which tend to focus on the institutional, political and humanitarian management of camps, but far less on the agency and political organization of refugees. In 2019, I spent time exploring the archives at the UNHCR headquarters in Geneva. But going through these archives, I was more confronted with the gigantic bureaucratic and logistical machinery of the organization than with the perception and voices of refugees inside camps. This points the limits of trying to distance and to put aside institutional framework of refugee and migration governance when archives of the other side, that is the lived experiences of the refugees, are so difficult to find and collect. But I was also astonished by individual and collective letters written by refugees that are in the UNHCR archives and that constitute a raw and valuable material about refugees' collective organization, claims, and conditions inside camps. I would like to build something on this in the future, to work around the issues of structural economy that this letter involved, and how these letters written by the refugees are used as a tool that both reveals the spatial and political power of the asylum governance and try somehow to bypass it.
Well, the next question I think probably picks up on some of what you both have already started to talk about, but I'd just like to ask you to elaborate on your research methodologies and the kind of conceptual frameworks that you use to analyze your findings. And it's clear, I think, we from the text that we read by both of you, that your work wants to elucidate not only the conditions faced by migrants, but also the agency that migrants exercise in challenging these conditions. So I'd just like to ask you to talk a bit more about your respective methods and how they seek to do these things and why this is important for your work.
Should I get started again first?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's where I want to talk about Marxist dialectical analysis, because this is really, for me, has become a key way of analyzing migration in a way that doesn't end up verifying the same categories of analysis that we have been given by previous mainstream analysis of migration. So when you engage with the kind of what people call the literature, and these are, by the way, ways in which academia is quite conservative. You have to sort of cite the people who have published these things long before you have come to the scene, regardless of how accurate or politically beneficial they might be, or they actually may not be those things. But your work will be measured by citing those people, right? So there's already a tendency to pulling your work towards a kind of more conservative media that I think it should be required. So what you end up finding when you look at that migration literature is typically a lot of kind of taken for granted matters, right? So the nation state becomes a completely taken for granted thing. And this is a thing that I critique seriously in my classes. So I do this kind of example with my students about, why is it that we have these words, migration and immigration? What is different, in fact, between these two things beyond the actual letters, right? And so we go through the factors that may motivate a person to migrate and to immigrate. And so, you look at, well, what is it that motivates people to move in these ways? And so it's, seeking a better life, job opportunities, poverty, natural disaster, these kinds of things. So, these are the same things that motivate a person to migrate across borders. In fact, many of the people who end up moving across borders move first within borders, right? So a lot of the people that end up moving, let's say, to the US, coming from Mexico, they first go to Mexico City, they go to another big metropolis in search of these opportunities. And so this is just to elucidate this point that there is not really anything different beyond the, if you adopt the point of view of the nation state, the receiving nation state, then you call these people immigrants because they cross a political border, right? But in fact, there's nothing substantively different. These are human beings that are moving across space for the same reasons, right? So I find that you have to be able to think beyond the analysis that you are encountering if you want to get to new and more, I think, politically expedient answers, right? So that's kind of what I have been dealing with. So yeah, you encounter these things like people talk about push and pull factors, as if that explain anything, but push and pull factors are just the same kinds of things that I ever described. The lack of access to jobs, the lack of access to a good salary, and those kinds of things. And then the other thing is that immigration scholarship tends to be deeply mired in like assimilationist sort of analysis. Why is it? And here too, they echo the kind of perspective of the nation state. Why aren't the immigrants assimilating into the mainstream? What is wrong with this new group of immigrants? And this is a question that is asked of every single group that migrates, as immigrants, right? So it has been asked of and I really apologize because a lot of my examples come from the US, and I know we're not in the US, and so this really sounds kind of like out of place. But they are applicable to most other places, I would think. So, they said this about Italians, Irish, Mexicans, why aren't they assimilating? What is the problem with the new group of immigrants? And so sociologists have come into the scene and other scholars have done the same to try to explain why is it that they haven't assimilated or how they will assimilate. But assimilating to what, right? So there's always that missing piece of how to analyze the concrete positions that they occupy in the economy, the function that immigrants serve for these economies, right? Which is really the reason for which they're migrating in the first place. And so, yeah, thinking about these things in a way that, and so here I keep saying theoretical analysis, and I haven't really explained much about what I mean by that. But what I mean is to be able to analyze the whole, or think about in the aspect of thinking about the whole first, and then choosing, in the words of Bertel Ollman, how to, you abstract something from that totality, and you focus your analysis on that totality, but always realizing that it's connected to the rest of the totality, right? And this is not typically done. What is typically done is, you describe a specific group of immigrants, and you talk about, why they're not assimilating, or whatever the case may be, but you cannot treat it as if it was disconnected from the larger totality. So you don't talk about what are the conditions that, first of all, motivate this migration in the first place, second of all, the ways in which they're receiving to the nation state, the ability for them to acquire a legal status or not. Those things don't really enter the picture. And so, one of the figures that for me has been a really positive influence has been the work of Nicolas de Genova. He was one of my advisors for my dissertation committee, and he has really been working on shifting this towards the creation of what he calls migrant illegality. So, not why is illegality something that attaches to these people as if it was an inherent quality to them, but rather why is it and what are the processes that come into play into creating these people as illegal subjects, right? And so I find that to be very powerful because then in that movement you get to see what are the factors at play and who is benefiting from that, right? Rather than just simply acting as if the migrants illegalize themselves in some kind of mysterious way. The challenges that I have encountered when it comes to this is that most work on immigration is not coming from that perspective, and so it's not typically encouraged or necessarily well regarded, right? So you kind of have to deal with that. Now the last point, we can come back to those points, the following questions. When it comes to migrant agency, part of the critique of these migration mainstream perspectives, it's also the fact that migrants do make choices too. They're not simply just pawns in these things. They are impacted and the choices are constrained in the ways that they can do things. But there is some element of, I wouldn't say revolution, but there's an element of rebelliousness. There's an element of refusing to abide by the conditions that the capitalist system has sentenced you to, right? So, if you're destined to live in poverty because that's the way that the colonial system and then the capitalist system have placed you into, you can choose to live even if that living is not legally sanctioned. And so there's an element there that I think is some kind of rebelliousness and refusal. I wouldn't say necessarily a sort of revolutionary consciousness because it's not really necessarily organizing politically around those things. It has the potential to be that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that, I think. So, I think that's what I do for now.
For me, the driving force of the deportees associations I've been working with was self-organization and the proclamation of autonomy on which they were based. They fiercely defend the idea that the people directly targeted by deportation policies are the most legitimate to speak out about their experience, which has an individual and common dimension. And they mostly refuse the principle of mediation, whether it comes from the institutionalized world of politics or humanitarianism. So I try to elaborate this with the help of notions such as micro and infrapolitics, Deleuze and Guattari, Scott, political subjectivation, Rancière, but to be very honest, some kind of theoretical reluctance grew up in me as I was conducting this research, because in the face of the deportees' hardships and struggles, I often felt the vanity to reduce or to size someone's suffering and struggle to pompous concepts. I very voluntarily downplayed my theoretical ambitions in order to be more what I would call an archivist of the present. I felt that on my very small level, the more useful thing I could do was to document these associations and movements which have received very little attention, and also to give them the importance and the attention they deserve was a way to struggle against all the epistemic violences that are at stake in migration studies. For example, when scholars use the states and international organizations categories like returnees, return migrants, or repatriated to name those who are the targets of deportation policies without taking into account the voices and claims involved in grassroots movements. The fact that scholars take the point of view of and reproduce and collude with the state apparatus is a crucial issue for me in the limitation to analyze infra-politics. Methodologically, I avoided as much as possible formal interviews that could be perceived as a continuation of the process of investigation involved in police procedures linked with imprisonment and deportation. Also, because in a post-colonial context, and given the weight of the role of anthropologists in the colonial history, to be the one who rules the conversation and establish a protocol to it was very problematic, to say the least. I don't really think in terms of methodology, but I think I simply tried to be present and also discreet, to listen, to analyze interactions through informal conversations, and to incorporate the political and ethical challenges of such a research into my practice as a researcher, but I would say most of all in my behavior as a human being. Probably the public forums organized by the Malian Deportees Association since 2007 were a decisive space and time for my research, because these forums set up the very principles of deportees grassroots movements, to create a public space for deportees' voices and demands, and to put deportees in the heart of a speech device on their own experiences. I think these public gatherings were decisive in turning deportation into a collective, common, and therefore political experience, and more broadly to turn deportation into a political issue in the public space. These public forums, but also the fact that deportees started to talk in the media on the abuses they had suffered and the more general issues involved in their mistreatment, turned them into interlocutors. The issues they raised were appropriated by some deputies in the Malian National Assembly and in the programs of political parties from the left with a strong Pan-Africanist and socialist ideology. And to come back to the idea of self-organization, the questions they raised and which progressively infused the public debate, only them could have formulated them, like the loss of the goods and the properties and money in the countries that deported them, the fact that they came back in their country with no luggage and no property. All these things could only come out of the people who directly experienced deportation.
Thank you very much. Now, Salvador, I wanted to ask you next about the chapter of your book manuscript in progress that we read. And I really appreciated how in this chapter you argue that criminalization, racialization, and illegalization are all mechanisms for ensuring superexploitation. And you also talk about how the social and political mechanisms for ensuring capitalist accumulation include the continual creation of social distinctions that function to basically produce divisions and stratification among the global proletariat. So I wanted to ask you to explain in greater detail why understanding this logic is so important for understanding class struggles, and also particularly for understanding the history and current dynamics of migration and bordering. What are its implications for how we should think about migrants as workers? And does this perspective help us to see relationships that borders have to other forms of social control that enable superexploitation?
Great questions. Yes, by the way, this chapter that you guys read for today. It's coming from my dissertation. I haven't really worked on that for a little while, but now I'm in sabbatical, so I had to go back into that and actually work on the book manuscript. So you have feedback, I really appreciate it. So this comes from that, but also, so let me talk very briefly about my book manuscript, and then we can sort of elaborate on that. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly interject. I have never seen that chapter on the program or anything.
No.
It's in the Google Drive. Oh, it's in the Google Drive. Yeah.
Oh,
Okay,
sorry.
okay.
Oh, it wasn't, okay.
No.
Oh, okay, well, so it's on the Google Drive. Hopefully you can get access to it and read
I'll look
it
at
after
it
the...
later.
Yeah. It's not very good, so you're not missing out. But so this is some theoretical, kind of work that I have been doing as part of my dissertation work on the meatpacking industry, and particularly the insertion and the procurement of new migrant groups into the meatpacking industry. So the title that Jennifer mentioned at the beginning of the conversation about La Jungla is a play on words on Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. He wrote this amazing book back in 1906. Upton Sinclair, by the way, if you don't know, he was a socialist, great socialist, by the way. And so he wrote this book about the insertion of migrants from Eastern Europe into the meatpacking industry and how they were treated, their abuses to where they were subjected. And so, I started to think about, well, how much has it changed then, since then? Because when I was working in construction, I was keeping up with people who were working in the meatpacking industry, particularly because these two industries were targeted by mass raids in the early 2000s. And so one of my sisters, by the way, worked in the poultry processing plant for a few years, and so I was very much interested in this and thinking about, well, what has changed and what has stayed the same. And so to my mind, what I started to see is that what has changed is that the group of people that work in these places look different, they sound different. They now look brown, they sound Latino, they have different kind of accents. They're now not mostly Eastern Europeans, but the conditions haven't really changed or improved that much. Perhaps instead of the catastrophic injuries of the early 1900s, now what you see is repetitive stress injuries, which nevertheless end up disabling and kind of really damaging these people over the lifetime of working in these kinds of places. And so these are some theoretical insights that I began to develop for that, and really I don't think they will have space to include all of that in that book. And so really what I'm trying to think about now is how to continue to elaborate this into my next, and I'm really ambitious already because I'm thinking about the next book and I haven't begun writing my first one, so that's just, how I'm thinking about it. But I'm really excited about that because what I am thinking about here is working on these ideas towards developing what I call the borders of capital. So that will be the kind of working title for the next project. And so really kind of digging deep into the development of these sort of stratifications that are created from the top down. And so we forget that this is true with race, but race wasn't a thing that has been with us since the beginning of times. These things become naturalized by the ruling class, but in fact, race becomes invented, as we know, in the United States in the 1600s, and you can find actually the first time the words white were inserted into the legal system in Virginia State Code in, I think, 1667, something around there. But if you're interested in that, you can look at the book, the work of Theodore Allen, The Invasion of the White Race, which is amazing. W.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction, also amazing. If you want to see how race becomes a way to manage the laboring populations in a way that seems to render natural what are actually artificially socially created divisions. But what they do is that they facilitate the control of laboring populations in a way that it doesn't now seem as if this is a mass of workers that are struggling as a common group against a common adversary, which is the ruling class, right? This is the primary contradiction of capitalism. But what in fact seems now is that you have different gradations in which different people, somehow based on their culture or based on some kind of inherent quality about them, are positioned in this stratification system. And so they occupy different rungs of this ladder. And so racialization process really enables that to take place. And so what I'm working on this is that immigration kind of does the same thing. So you create different statuses for different working people, right? Some of them are citizens, some of them are, quote unquote illegal. I really prefer the term illegalized. And towards the end of the chapter, if, you probably read it, but if you can get to the last part, I talk about how, in fact, I see the matter of the legalization of migrants as a continuum rather than as an on or off switch, right? So that you have not only citizens and undocumented people, but you also have temporary protected status recipients, you have refugees, you have asylum seekers with different kinds of, quasi-legal, quasi-undocumented status, so they kind of occupy some space in between. But these things become tremendously important for the management of workers within capitalism, right? Because really the fundamental thing becomes that as long as that's the case, you seem to be competing against each other for some kind of limited amount of goods and resources and rights, right? When in fact, we are really struggling against a common enemy, which is capital, and we can talk about more of that later. I don't know if I covered most of the relevant pieces of that question, but I can come back to more in a bit. Yeah.
I thought that was great. No, thank you. Clara, I wanted to ask you, so we read your chapter, Europe Confronted by Its Expelled Migrants, The Politics of Expelled Migrants Associations in Africa, which was published in The Borders of Europe, Autonomy of Migration, Tactics of Bordering, edited by Nicolas de Genova. So in this chapter, you identify a diverse range of tactics and political demands advanced by migrants' associations, and note that some of these are directed to the governments of migrants' countries of citizenships, other times to the governments of the European countries where they have resided, and other times they are articulated in the international fora that you mentioned. So in considering the diversity of political practices among expelled migrants, where do you see the greatest promise, and what are some of the most salient limitations of these practices? And how would you suggest that we think about the differences in the demands that are advanced, as well as the different relations migrants' associations establish to governmental agencies and to NGOs? And do you see that these different approaches do you think of them as complementary, or are they sometimes antagonistic?
Thanks for this question. One of the great achievements of the Malian Deportees Association was to allow the emergence of the deportees as political figures and as a group, making them visible in the public space. It contributed to transform deportation into a political issue instead of a private shame and humiliation. This transformation that was only possible through the passage to collective action and the sharing and gathering of experiences turned into a common political condition is for me in itself radical. It's not using the language of claim, but it's the affirmation of the presence and existence of individuals who have been historically oppressed, suppressed, and invisibilized. By their gathering, deportees says we draw our name from the very system which oppresses us. The contribution of the Malian Deportees Association was also to develop from the very beginning in the 1990s what I called a double critique of the state, that is condemning the violences and abuses committed by states which deport people, but also pointing out the responsibility of their own government of not protecting their nationals from such measures and even facilitating them. One angle through which mobilizations led by the Malian deportees associations have developed was to struggle against the signature by the Malian government of so-called readmission agreements included in development aid policy partnerships. Suddenly, the deportees were able to leverage an issue that a big part of civil society organizations and politicians could embrace because it's concerning the power relationships between nations and in particular with the former French colonial power. When I extended my initial investigation among Malian deportees associations to other African countries, I was keen on learning how deportees were able or restricted to gather and organize according to various political contexts. Their liminal position, even in their countries of origin, could be revealing of broader politics. The very nature of their mobilization and of the claims emerging from it was conditioned by the possibilities and limitations imposed by their political environment. For example, the Togolese Deportees Association, which was created in 2008, had to wait for years to be legally registered. And this Togolese association had forced to adopt more consensual topics of discussion than its Malian counterpart. The discourse developed in Sierra Leone by the network of ex-asylum seekers is not like in Mali a radical critique of the state, but rather an appeal to the state to assist deportees in the post-deportation sequence. So the position that deportees associations adopt is in great part conditioned by the possibilities and restrictions of the political regimes they live in. In this regard, deportees are not only revealing figures of the condition of foreigners in immigration countries, but also of the political situation of the countries they are expelled to. But I have also tried to show that the deportees' grassroots movements are not homogeneous. Due to the process of cooptation by states and international organizations of deportees association to manage so-called reinsertion projects and campaigns against the so-called dangers of irregular migration, which are in fact part of a broader political project to prevent African populations to migrate in Europe. So the emancipatory power of self-organization can also be used as a resource and an opportunity by states and international organizations to implement anti-immigration policies. There are certainly different and sometimes antagonistic positions among deportees associations. And the question of their impact is certainly a tricky one, given the enormous imbalance of power with states and international organizations apparatus. But the actions of the Malian deportees associations were certainly successful in 2008-9 and in 2016 to stop the Malian government from signing readmission agreements with France and Europe. And these actions have also certainly transformed the political debate around deportation in Mali and elsewhere in pointing out the responsibility of African governments. In Sierra Leone, the regular participation of the network of ex-asylum seekers in TV and radio shows aims to transform social representations of deportation, which would be the result of an individual crime or of an infraction to the law. So it's certainly a slow and somehow invisible process of awareness and public transformation, but it's also creating a very deep sense of community, brotherhood, and solidarity among deportees.
Wonderful, thank you. I have one more question for each of you, and then we'll open it up. So Salvador, I wanted to ask you if you find Marx's concept of the reserve army of labor useful for understanding how human mobility and bordering relate to capital accumulation. And does that concept comport with your argument that capital has a systemic requirement for a mix of labor of different statuses? And I also just wanted to ask if you could explain how do you see this need for a mix of labor of different statuses evidenced by your own research?
Great, thank you for the great question. So the short answer would be yes, that I do agree with Marx's idea of the reserve army of labor, but that I think that is not similar to my notion of what I call the legality continuum. So the idea that there's not just a one on or off switch. I also think here that it's not just that a certain segment of the population becomes simply off limits to the labor, quote unquote marketplace, but that there's different segments within that reserve army of labor that are included or excluded according to the needs of capital at that point in time. And so it's not just a mass of people that are just permanently excluded, but that they might be included and excluded, or even it might be the same people over time. So perhaps one illustration here could be the way that deportations have taken place at moments of economic crisis. So, one of the things that oftentimes students find shocking when we talk about these things in the classroom is how back in the mid-1930s, during the late 1920s, early 1930s, during the Great Recession in the United States, a lot of Mexican Americans were deported, and this is surprisingly because a lot of them were actually U.S. citizens. So they were born in the United States, they had U.S. citizenship, but nevertheless they were deported, and this is about 500,000 of them. And then the rest of them are actually just migrants or people who were actually Mexicans who didn't have U.S. citizenship. But so all these people that in a previous stage of economic production in the U.S. were recruited into the country, then at this point in time they're expelled, right? Because the country no longer has the need for their labor, and also it becomes a way to dissipate this economic anxiety that is now dissipating throughout the population. And so we see this time and time again, like this idea, we're seeing it now again with Ron DeSantis, of course Trump a few years ago, this constant castigation of migrants and the scapegoating of migrants, right? But it's not always the case. If you listen to the speeches of even Ronald Reagan, George Bush in the late 80s, early 90s, you see them talking about immigration and immigrants in a way that is much more humane than they do now. And so these things kind of ebb and flow over time according to, one, the needs of capital, and two, what's happening in those states with regards to popular dissatisfaction. So how can they control the crisis, in the words of Stuart Hall again, how can they police that crisis in a way that doesn't threaten to become a systemic crisis, right? That doesn't seem to actually call into question the legitimacy of the state and the legitimacy of capitalism, which is actually now becoming called into question. So that would be kind of the shortish answer, but I want to just give a couple more comments on the paper, because a lot of you didn't get a chance to read it then before we move on. So one of the things that I try to do in that paper is to really take a deep historical analysis as to the origin of migration within capitalism. So not just migration as a sort of human feature of people moving across space for millennia, quite literally, but how does it work within capitalism? And here I really am, quite informed by Marx's, analysis of the closure of the commons and what he calls the secret of so-called primitive accumulation, right? So he talks about how, in order to produce wage laborers, you had to dispossess people from their land. You had to, first of all, throw them off the access to having their own means of social reproduction, their own means of subsistence, and you have to keep them out of those things, right? And so I'm making this kind of analysis, this kind of parallel between the enclosure and a border. So to me, an enclosure is nothing more than a border that kind of dictates and guides where people can or cannot be. And so if they don't have access to the land that they need to socially reproduce themselves, they have to become wage workers. So something similar happens with migrants is that, you know, these things are erected and all of a sudden their mobility is restricted and controlled in a way that is servicial to capitalism. And so, yeah, fundamentally, I think it's important to remember that at the end of the day, we're dealing with, you know, contrary to what people may have you believe, there's no racism within human groups. We know that. And so we're one humanity as a totality, and so how do we then fall into these traps of thinking that have us think that we're actually national members of a specific nation state, and that the interests of the nation states are somehow the same interests that we should have as people, when in fact our interests are much more in line with those of other working people from different nation states. One of the famous quotes from Marx here is that, you know, the working men have no country, but you know response. But even so, it appears that we are constantly belonging to these countries, even though working men have no country. Working men can become a generic for working people, of course. Yeah, so I didn't want to rehash too many of the comments from the paper, but I now know that many people didn't get a chance to read it. I kind of wanted to hit a couple of the high points of that. If you get a chance to, yeah, I appreciate it. You can take a look at it and send me any feedback that you may, have. That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. And Clara, I wanted to ask you, so your chapter really demonstrates that the political discourse and practice of expelled migrants has much to teach us about the effects of European imperialism and colonialism, current European political structures, as well as African migrants' demands for greater protections from their countries of origin. So could you please talk about the ways transnational migrants collectively politicize the particular social position they occupy? How does this point towards distinct ways of conceiving of citizenship and political rights in light of the realities of migration and imperialist globalization?
Thank you. It's obviously the most difficult question, but I'll try to give some clue to answer to it. I would say first that the political and social positions are radically different whether we speak of a sans-papier struggling for papers or a deportee destitute and abandoned by his or her state and society of origin. The states are different because in many Western countries the work is a major factor of regularization. And the sans-papier struggle, especially from the sans-papier worker, as the French movement of strikes of sans-papier workers supported by unions and employers has shown, these struggles are somehow fitting to the pragmatic economic utilitarianism of the workforce exploitation and turnover. Even when sans-papier struggles ask for the regularization of all the freedom of movement, it's still the state's logic and apparatus that come out reinforced.
You mentioned to make sure that sans-papier means.
Oh, yeah, sorry, undocumented.
Yeah, so sans-papier is undocumented.
In the same spirit, when deportees express their feeling of abandonment and destitution vis-à-vis their state of origin, it's still the state that appears to be the missing or failing ally. So it's kind of difficult to reflect on these struggles and demands away from the state's apparatus and its logic. This past years, I worked on a project called Deportation with my colleague William Walters from Carleton University in Ottawa. And the project aimed at studying the logistics underlying deportation by air, as well as the movements that have formed to struggle against deportations inside the airports and elsewhere. We wrote together an article based on research on the archives and publications of anarchist collectives that were created in the end of 1990 and onward in France and other European countries to struggle against what they called the deportation machine, la machine à expulser in French. These collectives were the first to do a sort of inventory of all the components, rouage, stakeholders underlying the system of deportation, from the airline companies to the companies who built and maintained detention centers. One striking thing is that a major factor of tension and dissolution of these groups came from the position they occupied in the sans-papiers, undocumented migrants movements. The fact that these collectives could invest their time and effort to help the sans-papiers cope with the bureaucratic procedures towards regularization was for some of them contradicting the exact spirit of anarchist struggles against the state and capitalism. And anarchists developed a fascinating political critique out of this. They reflected on the isolation and uselessness of mobilizations that would remain specific to migrants and that would contribute to reproduce the objectification of the figure of the migrant by the state. Anarchists were keen on building common struggles that would reunite foreigners and citizens, and these struggles would be founded on what they call reciprocity. These common grounds could be the struggle against what anarchists have called the tout carceral, the carceral society or the carceral wall. And another common ground of these common struggles could be the process of global precarization. And maybe we can discuss about this later, because I think maybe there are comparisons to be made with international workers' movement. But I guess the main limit of migrants' mobilizations on the issue of work is that these mobilizations are extremely fragmented, uneven, when not simply impossible, according to each national political context. So it seems to be, but maybe we can discuss about this, that the idea of a united international front against the exploitation and oppression of migrants' workforce that would aim at destabilizing the current conditions of capitalism is not really reachable at this moment of history.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to open it up for questions from you all. Thank you both, and I think we'll very much for your presentation. So I already see we've got some questions in the room, questions online. I'll take first a round of questions in the room, and then we'll take a round online. Okay, Stephen?
Only first?
My question is kind of to both speakers, maybe more to Salvador specifically on this one front, which is that I found the work not to be bad at all. I found the work to be amazing. Everyone should read it. I mean, I struggle against your humility yet again. But really about this, what you opened with, along the lines of the personal narrative, when you were talking about this, there is a rebelliousness in the attitude of people in this kind of precarity and criminalization, illegality continuum, as you say, but not quite revolutionary consciousness, you say. Though, and then you said, and maybe this was more parenthetical, but you said, but though that is possibly there. And I'm really, I mean, just as a communist organizer, that's where my primary concern is. Like, I don't want to write the next paper on it. I want to organize the next struggle, and or be a part of that organizing somehow. And as you know, so I was a formerly incarcerated person. Interestingly enough, in my county jail before I went to prison was Green Bay County Jail, which used to be Green Bay Meatpacking, and it was erased, and you could see where county jail had been put over the meatpacking. And it's in Texas, so it was also mostly with a lot of migrant laborers, and they would be split along Paisas and Chicanos, and then, you know, whites and blacks, etc. And so my experience of this was that people did have this rebelliousness against COs, against local government, against their employers, and sometimes like, oh, their wives, because there's child support, whatever. But it wasn't mobilizable in a revolutionary way, where we could say, what is the common problem for all of us, and how can we unite organizationally to have some political teeth? And in a lot of ways, that that rebellion spirit, while there, was constrained because of the severe limitations of the material conditions that led them to that point, right? Where it's like, on one hand, you could be talking about, you know, Malcolm X or something like that, and people would be motivated. On the next night, you're in your bunk, and people won't shut up about motorcycles and bikinis, and it's like, what are you talking? Like, why can't we just like get this together just for a minute? So I guess, like, you know, because the conditions have led both migrant laborers and prisoners, other forms of criminality, those conditions are homelessness and drug use and misery and malaise of all sorts and all kinds of violence, sexual and otherwise. And so they're so disorganized at the level of consciousness that sometimes I'm like, well, maybe we need some more cooperation between the more stable parts of the working class who could see friendship in these more precarious parts of the working class, or however you want to pitch that. And I guess I just wanted to give you both the opportunity to talk about the kinds of organization that could structure the rebellion into something real, like the real dragon, as Ho Chi Minh said. The prison gates have to fly open so the real dragon can fly out. What could be the threshold of livability, the political organization? I'm sure if you knew this, it would already have happened, but what are the pathways forward?
Thank you. We'll take it. There's some other questions? Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Is it Nick? Yeah.
Are they turned off for some reason? The audience ones?
Oh, they shouldn't be.
Unless
something came on
Mine
works. Let me make sure.
Where's the cable?
Is there one that's unplugged? Because they're wired in series, so they all have to be.
Do we have it in here?
Okay, can we all test?
Mine's the last one.
Yeah, we're all pressing it. The censorship.
Yeah, exactly.
We've heard enough.
Oh yeah, I think if you just plug it.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
They work,
Oh, I got it.
So this rebellious spirit over here. We're live here? Yeah. Okay, great.
Okay, cool. Thank you both so much for that. My question is really short, and I think it's a little more for Claire, and just sort of a hyper-contemporary question. I was wondering how or if a lot of these expelled migrants associations, the Malian Expelled Migrant Association perhaps that you mentioned in the paper here, how are they involved in sort of internal affairs and insurrections, especially given, I think, here in France recently the protests over the police murder of Nayab. And I'm just wondering how they were involved with it, if there's any discourse from them that you might know about it, how they consider themselves in relation to events like that. But yeah, thank you.
João?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I think mine is more to Salvador, maybe is a suggestion, maybe to comment, but I don't know if you're aware of, and Lorenz and Felix, they may correct me in case I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, in Germany, 2015, they introduced the minimum wage there, and it's interesting that the timing, because when the whole migration crisis was happening in Europe, and the Germans took over, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 1 million Syrians, and when they introduced the minimum wage, they also introduced something like a clause that was Ausnahmsfall, and that means an exception, which means that some groups wouldn't be like, if you're doing working for a company for the summer, you're not entitled to these sort of things, but then the refugees as migrants, they're also embedded in this clause, and the reasoning would be for integration. And I think it's quite interesting because it reflects directly to what you're speaking, but people who often would come with degrees of engineering, like really high degrees, and then they would often end up working in meat industry, which was the industry which most Europeans don't want to touch anymore, not only because of the whole environment, but also the conditions of labor in those industries are quite deplorable usually. So I think it really relates to your point. Maybe, I don't know if you want to comment on that, or maybe use as a case study for your further studies.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tiffany?
Can you hear me? Okay. This is more of a question for Sal. I guess this is an incomplete thought, so I'm just roll with me here. I'm wondering about how you would conceptualize the difference or the relation between the figure of the migrant and the indigenous through a Marxist lens, because there's a really interesting difference in the sense that you could, like, as far as like one's moving, one's not, right? So you have migrants sort of like imposing on nation states, and then for indigenous, you have nation states sort of imposing on the indigenous, right? So there's this really interesting inverse relationship.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious if you could just sort of toy with that idea and toy with, just what are some of your thoughts on that, especially from this like a materialist lens, and what this means, rather than from like an identity difference in identity as far as like hybridity and all that sort of stuff.
Do you guys want to take those questions to start?
Yeah, it's good. You want to start this time?
Okay. To the first question, it's obviously very, very difficult to answer, because I don't know which kind of organization will be able to structure all these claims globally. And maybe I rely on some of you here to draw some comparison with international movement of workers at the end of the 20th century, with the leader of things to think related to this. I'm rather pessimist, because at least on what I've observed, there is such enormous tendency among states, international organizations, and humanitarian associations to, I would say, integrate all dissident movements, and to incorporate the critic, even radical, into their own functioning and apparatus. That whenever there are like emergent political subjects, they are somehow caught by a process of instrumentalization and incorporation into the functioning of whether it's international organization, humanitarian association. So there is a kind of cleverness, of institutionalized bodies to use emergent subjects into their own functioning. And that's why I think it's really, really difficult to structure something outside, of institutionalized bodies. And to the question about the eventual involvement of the Malian Deportees Association in the French public debate and events around the murder of Naël. The Deportees Malian Association usually don't intervene, I would say, in the French current affairs, except for denouncing the adoption of continuously new immigration laws, but their intervention is really limited to the field of migration policies, and eventually issues of racism, like structural racism and discrimination against foreign asylum seekers and so on, but it doesn't go beyond.
Great, lots of really good questions. Let's see if I can remember what was asked. Probably not. So Stephen, yeah, that's a really great question, and I think there's a lot of tension there between the migrants' specific kind of goals in their migration journey. So leaving because you struggle with poverty, immiseration, lack of opportunities. In my case, even not being able to go and continue my education, right? So different kinds of things. So you have a sort of like a perspective as an individual, by definition, right? And at the same time, you have the responsibility of caring for those that you left behind, whether it be your husband, your wife, your partner, your children, whatever you have. And so there's that pressure that you have to go and get a job and get those dollars, those euros, and start sending back money to help them out, right? And so there's that tension between the individual desire to do the thing that you came to do, and then your status as a worker. And I think it's difficult to think about how that may change previous to the immigration journey or in the transition period. But in the arriving to the destination country, that is where I think there's a lot of opportunity for organizing from socialists. That is where I think a lot of people can start to reach out and talk about, well, this is not just happening to you. And some of the things that Joao mentioned, for instance, with the fact that many of these people are excluded from the basic protections that are often passed. Talking about that and trying to organize along those lines will be super important. It doesn't happen all that often, but occasionally it does happen. There's moments in time in which you can see that potential coming to the surface. 2008, those great migration marches that took place was a lot of that effervescence that was there for potential organizing. There's always, of course, people who take advantage of that. There's always people looking to make a name for themselves who only want to kind of use that as a way to say, hey, we can deliver more votes to you. We can, I represent this potential purchasing, kind of potential out there, and so those kinds of things. So you hear discussions about the purchasing of Latinos and these kinds of things. Those becomes things that people take advantage of. But I think, yes, there's a lot of fertile ground for socialists to come into contact and to organize. And I think it's a desirable goal for sure. Yeah, and we have to actually battle here the pressure from identity politics. I know, that's a constant. So for instance, when the migration caravans took place in, I forget here, 2016, 2017, I want to say sometime around, and this, if you're not familiar with that, this big, organized movements in which people from mostly Honduras, Guatemala, and other places were kind of coming together to live together so that they had some sense of protection in being a larger group, right? From traffickers and drug cartels and police, right, who beat them up and all these kinds of things. And so there's that, and there's also at the same time, I remember there was a lot of people in the US particularly who chose to support specific members of those migration caravans on the basis of their identity, rather than the migration caravan as a whole. So they will say like, well, I want to make donations, but only to the queer people in the migration caravan, not to the workers as a whole. You can support whoever you want to, but when you start picking and choosing at that level, it just seems kind of like you're kind of helping to break up that potential organization even further, right? And of course, I think one of the things that Jennifer talked about yesterday was the sort of imperialist mission now of a lot of the intellectuals in the US to kind of explore these things abroad, these kinds of, liberal conceits, right? Whatever we call that anyways. Maybe I'm quoting wrong, so I will attribute that to you. And so that brings me to Joa's point. This is a very common thing. Migrants are quite often excluded from these protections. They have been for hundreds of years. So the agriculture industry in the United States is famously left out of most labor organizing contracts. The protections don't apply to workers in those kinds of fields. And they are some people who need it the most. Like right now, we're dealing with increasing heat waves that are oppressive, that people have to work under, producing the goods that we end up consuming, all the vegetables and plants in California, those kinds of states. Texas, by the way, just rolled back some basic protections about having water breaks. The governor of the state proudly took that back. So that happens all the time. And here is where I think that race often ends up tricking us into thinking about things in a less radical way. If you think about this, when you drive to these places in Central California, Fresno, all these places where people are working, bent over in those fields, doing that hard labor, you think for a moment, what would the reaction be if all those people were white? Or if all those people were black? Would that not shock your system into some kind of realization that there's something profoundly wrong? But because we have become accustomed to the naturalization of these groups of workers as inherently suited for that kind of labor, because that's what the capitalist ruling class has told us, we don't bat an eye. That seems normal, right? And by the way, this dovetails nicely into Tiffany's question. A lot of the workers are indigenous themselves. A lot of the migrant workers are indigenous. So when you go to California, you have a lot of people from Oaxaca, Guerrero, the southern states of Mexico that are mostly indigenous populated. Because the oppression that they have been subjected to in those places, they end up having less opportunities than other members of the population, impoverished as they might be. So they often end up being the same kinds of people, right? I think Professor Lecadet just now was talking, or before that she talked about migrants, I think, or maybe I misheard that. But the Mayans, Guatemalans, people from different places, that's the people that end up doing a lot of the, and this is a quote that I have become more critical of. It's not the labor that others don't want to do, it's the labor that others have the ability to refuse to do, right? Nobody wants to do this kind of labor. Migrants don't want, when I was a construction worker, I didn't want to do that kind of work. It was shitty, it sucked, it was hot, right? I think partly I became an academic just to know how to do the work anymore. I don't know, it was a good trade-off because now I have to work all the time, even on my weekends, so. But it is true, it is not that people don't want to do those jobs, it's that they have the ability to say no. Right, and that is a thing that migrants don't often have, and that's why they're more profitable. Right? Your service to the capitalist class is your labor, and so you want to be a good laborer because that's your value to that system. Yeah.
Let's take some questions online. Sabrina, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. I have a question that's a little bit more, again, switching gears. Salvador, you talked a little bit about color and like you talked a little bit about brownness and the appearance of different races in terms of their color, working in these particular positions that you're talking about. And I'm also, this is like part of my dissertation, is thinking about passing for white, and narratives about passing for white during the early 20th century, wherein like migration and immigration changed the black-white divide of the North and South, and the division between slavery and enslaved, and the planter class in the 19th century had kind of transformed in the early 20th century because black workers were being immigrated or were migrating to the north in the Industrial Reserve Army there. So I wanted to ask you about this like discourse of visibility, if we could just kind of break it down from not just the discourse level, but to the materiality of the sort of embodied experience of this geopolitical subject as part of this class totality and these nationality relations that encounter all of us. In other words, like, how does a passing person experience what you were talking about in terms of your experience, maybe differently than what you experienced? Or is there like a sort of color gradation that you could talk about in terms of like light skin, I guess what's colloquial known as like light skinned privilege, but what I would call is like the ability to have more class mobility, because one is able to like pass completely for white due to the sort of you know, I'm just thinking about like how people who are, you know, going to Mexico and raping Mexican women or something like that, I don't even think of that, but like white tourism basically contributing to this sort of like lightening of the Mexican population in Mexico. At least that's something that I've experienced. And this is like personally like something I've experienced. So yeah, I just wanted you to talk a little bit about that. Sorry, I rambled a lot now.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much for your talk. So this might be a big question, but for my research, one thing that is a big focus is the Syrian civil war, and one of the most fascinating things about that conflict is the politics around migration and refugees. Obviously, there's the migrant crisis of the past 10 years in the wake of NATO's overthrowing of Gaddafi in Libya and involvement in the Syrian civil war. And you would have phenomenon, like really fascinating phenomenon of like Turkey threatening the EU, saying, well, you know, if you don't do this for me, I'll send my refugee population over to your territory, and kind of using migrants and refugees as a weapon. And refugees, migrants also not being totally without agency. Many of them organized and formed their own interest groups and had their own agendas regarding like the Syrian civil war. So my question for, I think both of you is, how has migration and refugee flows changed or shaped geopolitics in the past, say, 15 or 20 years? And do you have any thoughts about immigrants and refugee self-agency in pressuring or applying their agency and force to the influencing geopolitics themselves, rather than just being kind of tools in geopolitical games?
Thanks. Marshall?
Yes. Okay, thank you so much. I think my question is probably going to be more for Professor Salvatore, and I've actually followed your work in the article with William Robinson, critiquing Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism. A fascinating article, and your work now is really at the core of my interest in terms of expanding the Patnaik's work around the necessity of this reserve army of labor, and you're viewing sort of these migration populations as being, or the multitudes and forms to which they take to allow for what they will call as a stimulus to the capitalist formations, as opposed to looking at these pre-capitalist or non-capitalist groups as a pre-setting to what we're looking at now and not applying. So what I want to ask is, what is the ground of synthesis, looking at these epistemological lineages of violence and stories of violence that are certainly, I mean, in the Malian sense, we know the direct atrocities that are acted upon these populations, but what is the sort of ground of synthesis to this ontological world system that we're talking about in the Wallersteinian sense that is also incorporated with a historical and dialectical tracing of the nation state in this as well? And I guess to finalize that is, you know, looking at Professor Robinson's work in the transnational capitalist class, there's a sort of a blending of nationalities within this. So I want to just ask, where do you see the past in the creation of these migration forces and these reserve armies within the context of these the question of the nation state? That's a lot.
And Jonathan.
Yes, thank you both for your comments. This one, I have two questions. First one's for Professor Lecadet. I was hoping you could speak to the current expulsion crisis going on in Tunisia right now, if you had any comments about that. And then for both, could you speak to state repression in response to migrant organization?
And then we'll take Felix's question.
Hello. So yeah, my question goes back to something that Salvador just said in an answer to yet another question. That it's about the combating of identity politics. And you talked about the case where, for example, some activist helping groups came to the refugee track and only, cared about what was it? I think queer migrants. And so I wanted to sort of push you on that point because I think these activists don't do that out of a sense of, only these people are worth helping, but they do it out of a sense of there are certain stratifications even within, the overall group of, for example, migrants. And some people are usually easier forgotten than others. And so I think that is one of the things where they say we sort of target, quote unquote, queer people specifically because they are often forgotten. We sort of, in Germany we had, for example, the same thing when Ukrainian refugees came here, and there was a huge distinction in how white Ukrainian refugees were treated by the German state and black Ukrainian refugees. And so there were also, instances where like activist group sort of opened help centers explicitly only for black refugees from the Ukraine, which also, created tensions, of course, because there were also white people coming there and they were turned away. But the reason for that was because they could formally apply in the state's agencies, and for black refugees that was harder to do. And so, my question is, how do we sort of how do we engage with this real stratification and diversity while at the same time not disregarding the need for unity in action? How do we combine that dialectically, so to speak?
Wonderful, thank you for all these questions.
I can try to take a stab at it the first time, and then I will let the other expert take a handle of what I messed up. So, there's a lot of questions. I think we just come back tomorrow for this. There's so much homework. I had to do research, and I don't know, there's a lot. So let's think about this. Let's see. So Sarina asked about white passing and privilege and these kinds of things. That's a complicated matter. I don't know. It's not. so what I talk about is racial and class relations. It's not in racialized groups. I don't really believe in races. I don't talk about races. I think this language really traps us into this model of thinking that kind of really thwarts any sort of effective analysis. That's my perspective on that. So I think when I talk in terms of race, I try to think about in terms of racialized groups and racialized class relations, because I think then in that sense, we retain that material, concrete analysis that allows us to ground our analysis in a way that is really effective and actually reflects that reality. And it doesn't just take the language or the bourgeoisie that has given us this language of race that is, in many ways the voice of any potential, material analysis. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's what it has become. So this really good book by, Toure, Adolf Fried's son, Race Reductionism, is an excellent book. If you haven't procured it, I would highly suggest it to anybody interested in these matters. So Marxists often become accused of being class reductionist. What he demonstrates, and many Marxists already know well, and other people who pay attention to these matters, is that really what we're dealing with constantly is race reductionism. It's trying to explain things with reference to race. And so it gets complicated. It's hard to answer this in a matter of like a very short, pithy answer, but I would pay attention to legal status, relation to the state, more so than white passing. I don't know, how much. The fact that white tourists are able to go to Mexico is not because they're white, it's because they have a visa and they have the US sort of nationality that gives them that, Jennifer talked about that before, but the sort of sense of being part of the labor aristocracy, right? So I wouldn't say it's because of their skin color that they're able to travel freely and set up shop in Mexico and get paid in dollars and take advantage of the Mexican sort of cheaper living standards, but it's because they have that ability to travel freely due to that legal status. So I will sort of focus on that myself. I think you may have already read this book, but White by Law by Ian Haney Lopez, I think will be super helpful if you haven't come across it yet. Really interesting book, and one of the things that stood out to me from that book is the way that him, and not only him but other people talk about this case, but the case of Bhagat Singh, this Indian immigrant in the 1920s who asked to be included as a citizen of the United States because he says, it seems to me that you're saying that to be included into whiteness, you had to be part of the ruling class. I am, in fact, part of a ruling class. I'm part of a ruling caste in my country. I come from the elite, so I should be included into whiteness. And so it's a really interesting process of asking to be included into the project of whiteness, because that's where he sees privilege being, or I try to skew the language better, but that's where he sees kind of more advantages being kind of provided. And so he's saying, I may not be white by skin color, but I am white in my elite status, and I know quite well how to discriminate because I am from a ruling caste in my home country. That's the book. It's called White by Law by Ian Haney Lopez. Super interesting. You want to check that out. Ben's question about Civil War, I'm not really familiar too much with that, but I would say that one of the things that I suggest that we be kind of more critical of is that we don't have an immigration crisis. We have a crisis of capitalism.
Yeah.
These things are often presented to us as a crisis of this or crisis of that. No, capitalism is the crisis, right? So I would just kind of re-emphasize paying attention at where the locus of power comes from and where we're analyzing these things. The more substantive matter of answering the question with regards to the Syrian civil war, I would kind of leave to Professor Lecadet, but I will also just say briefly that the weaponization of migrants is a real thing. I mean, just look at what DeSantis is doing in Florida, right? Quite literally trafficking people to other states like California, New York City, and other places to, under false pretenses, to kind of make it seem that these people are the responsibility of somebody else. This guy doesn't even live in a border state. He doesn't live in Texas. He's going to Texas to pick up migrants to traffic into other places. How is he not being prosecuted for this? I don't know, but he should be. Let me move quickly through a couple more points because I don't want to take too much time. Marshall, thank you for reading that piece. I'm glad you liked it. That's great to hear. It has gotten me a lot of trouble, so I'm at least glad that some people did like it. So, one of the things that we know about migration is that most of the migrants that where they migrate to tends to be the former colonial powers, the former colonial centers. So Jamaicans migrate to the UK, people in Latin America, Mexicans migrate to the US, Filipinos migrate to the US also. So we kind of know that that's what happens. So that patterning of the migration kind of receiving, setting and receiving countries is very much established at the early colonial era. One of the things that, and I don't mean to speak for him, see, he has his own work and you can read it and reflect on that, but William Robinson talks about is that, so that's true, we also need to pay attention to how inequalities are happening not just across states but within states, so that we now have mass impoverishment in the core countries, not just in the former colonial countries. So if you don't believe that, you can drive through South Central LA, and you will see what I'm talking about. You will see these 10 cities that Hoover will be quite proud of, right? So that's what I would say. It's not. So the pattern, the historical pattern, is very much there. It's super important to pay attention to that. It does pattern and structure how migration takes place in the present, but poverty, immiseration, proletarianization happens also within countries, and so that's also we need to pay some attention to that. Thank you for that, Ben. I'm glad you watched that. I hope you liked it, the video interview. I feel like I'm taking too much time, so maybe I'll just stop there. Yeah, Jonathan, I'm with you. State repression of migrants happens all the time. That's how they keep working more exploitable. That's how they keep. So I wrote an essay when Trump was elected called "How Neoliberalism Paved the Way for Trump's presidential campaign." And in that part, what I'm trying to do is look at how, in the state of constant capitalist crisis, but further, kind of intensified in the last few years, in which neoliberalism has really kind of taken effect in the United States and impoverished a lot of the populations that before were perhaps not subjected to the worst ravages of capitalism. The castigation and the repression of migrants is doing two things at the same time, that is controlling those migrants to contain them as a more exploitable reserve army of labor. It's also sending a message to the people that are not them to say, I am with you, white worker in the Midwest or whatever else, I'm protecting you from those, kind of, pressures of those migrant workers who come here to take your jobs, right? By the way, we should question why we're so attached to jobs. I don't want a job. I want a good, decent standard of living. However that comes by. Why are we so fighting so much for having a job, right? Anyways, that's for a different discussion. Okay, I cannot stop talking without answering Felix's question briefly. I cannot help myself. Yeah, okay, I'm with you. The activists are choosing to highlight some voices that they feel are neglected. But what if there are queer white migrants in the caravan? How do they now sort of schedule which ones should get priority and which ones shouldn't? My point is that this kind of fragmentation further kind of disorganizes the working class and the potential revolutionary sort of seal that may be kind of brewing within those migration caravans or those migration groups. So that's my point, is not that they don't have the right to choose who they help or the rationale for doing so. What they're thinking, I don't know, but my point being that the moment you start doing that, are you not actually disorganizing some of these groups? And which order should you rank them? Should you choose queerness or whiteness first? And then what about a place of origin? I think that's something we should think about, right? That's too much that I talked about. I should stop now.
The question about how refugee flows have framed geopolitics is obviously a very, very important one. I would say maybe they have shaped all the history of the 20th century till today. But I wanted to mention maybe the most famous example, during the Cold War. I wanted to mention the most famous example of how refugees' perceptions are framed by geopolitics. In the Cold War, there was a very positive and valuable image of refugees flying the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc in general. and United States on its allies invested a lot of money, to receive refugees fleeing from the east, and we see that now it has turned totally into the opposite direction. Migrants, refugees are mostly seen in a negative and also criminalized way. So it's very interesting to see how refugees and migrants figures are framed into the political interests of every period in history. And I wanted to quote an historian, Glenn Peterson, who made some kind of an invitation to write an alternative history to the international regime of refugees, in which, I'm translating my approximately English, in which the non-European and colonial worlds would not be invisible or peripheral, but in the center of the dominant narrative. So, yeah, I think it's very important always to keep in mind that the asylum and migration governance is a European and American invention, and it was built and still is run according to United States and the Western countries' interests. And yeah, and I wanted to answer on the question on the situation in Tunisia, which is obviously horrendous, but I wanted also to tell that it's an unfortunately added episode to a long history of totally hidden deportation process inside I mean, from the North Africa to the Sub-Saharan Africa, and since the 1990s there have been like thousands of deportations operated through land inside the Saharan desert by Algerian policies, Tunisian, Libyans, and so on. And it's quite interesting that when the drawings in the Mediterranean Sea became mediatized, and there were a lot of mobilizations around this, and there was, alarm phone that was created to signal the drawing in the Mediterranean Sea. A parallel process took place for the deportations happening in the Saharan desert. So now you have an alarm phone, and in a recent time we have seen videos surfacing about people, running errands in the desert and dying in the desert because of being expelled. And there is unfortunately nothing new, it's a long history, but through the power of social medias and mobilization, we are starting to be able to document these processes. And also to the question about the state's repression of migrants' organization, I would say that it's in the very historical nature of nation states to suppress migrants' political activity and participation. I mean, it's historically how nation states have been constructed and have evolved. So, even, I mean, in France, for example, when migrants get papers, still they don't have the right to vote, So this idea that even for people in a legal situation, they would not benefit from the same political rights as foreigners is very typical of the way states consider immigration and foreigners on their territories. And I just wanted to add that the deported associations I was speaking about have also been confronted with states' repression. For example, when the Malian Deported Association demonstrated too hard in front of the Malian parliament to denounce the possibility of the signature of readmission agreements, they were really chased and beaten up by the Malian police. And thereafter they organized a forum to denounce the limits of freedom of expression and demonstration in the public space. I thought it was interesting also that deportees, in a time where Mali was in a democratic situation, let's say, it was also interesting that the deportees mobilizations were showing, the limits of such democratic regime and the limits. Sorry, I stopped. My resources in English are over. Non, ce que je voulais dire, c'est, we'll try this translation. Ce que je voulais dire, c'est que c'était intéressant aussi de voir que les expulsés, dans une situation qui était considérée à l'époque comme démocratique, pouvaient, à l'intérieur de leur propre État, d'une certaine manière, être les révélateurs des limites de l'exercice de la liberté d'expression et de manifestation dans l'espace public, et des sortes comme ça de témoins, de héros, de l'endroit jusqu'où on pouvait pousser les limites de l'acceptabilité.
Yeah, so just that those who were expelled from purportedly democratic countries had the unique role of being the revealers of the undemocratic elements within those systems, and therefore they kind of brought that to the fore, right?
Well, I think do you have a question?
Yeah, just really quick.
Okay, because we have okay, when do we?
Well,
we've got
another number here too. So
okay, we'll take them as quick as we can, and we have a bunch of questions. Okay.
All right, cool. So thank you so much for the talks. I really enjoyed them. Very kind of informative and elucidating. My question was for Salvador. Basically, I was really intrigued by your writing on the sort of hydraulic models, and the kind of language around that really interested me. in part because of Lucy Irigary's critiques of Freud's psychoanalysis, this idea of like, you know, the kind of language he uses and borrows from thermodynamics, and I kind of see that sort of similarly being done here. And I'm curious if you could maybe talk about the ways in which that kind of language or idea maybe has a sort of scientific, but not scientific, whereas, you know, with Marxism, science, with this other view, maybe kind of just aestheticizing a kind of science or viewpoint. And I just thought that was really interesting if you could maybe elaborate on that. Thank you.
I'm sorry to be reductionist because I'm from Haiti. So when it comes to actually anti-blackness, when it comes to immigration, we actually experienced this in the 1990s when it comes to the boat people, the mistreatment of Haitians boat who actually went to Miami, and the way they went like when you compare it to the Cuban at the time. And it's also when it comes to like the new migration from Chile, Brazil, and Mexico, the way that Haitians are mistreated not only by the border patrol from the American side, but also by the Mexican.
Oh yeah.
So you can see there's actually an anti-blackness also there. And to actually talk about like the lack of organization when it comes to migrant workers, like there's also, I know people who actually on the community, they will never go to demonstration, even though when they have their green card, because they're always scared that they're gonna be deported.
Yeah.
So that's this aspect of it. So because I feel like anti-blackness play a big role when it comes to actually laws, when it comes to the US institution, and also even when you look at the Biden program that actually rolled out at the beginning of the year, there are more Ukrainians getting accepted than Haitians or Cubans.
Right.
And I think, you know, for the sake of time, was your question real urgent?
Well, I can make it
Bring
very
it real quick and then we'll...
No, it's kind of a question and a thought. Thank you both very much. I just want to say, I'm from Greece, so we've seen kind of like the dual mode of governance that we talked about last week. What's going on with having concentration camps inside of the country. And I just want to talk about this thing that we heard from Professor Lecadet about building struggles with locals and immigrants and the sense of solidarity and community between different groups and how they can coincide. Because let's say in the past 2 months in Greece we've had 650 people that got murdered by the Greek state, essentially in the European Union, at Pylos with the boat, the shipwreck. Then there was a 20-year-old Syrian refugee that was killed about a week ago, something like that, by the police. And 3 days ago, a trans woman from Cuba was also murdered. And I'm bringing all these things up because we had an insurrection that lasted for a whole month in Greece in 2008 when a kid, a local, Grigoropoulos, was murdered by cops. And obviously we need to have reactions when every person gets murdered or attacked or anything by the state and by capital. So I want to talk about how important it is what you brought up about those movements from the 90s that were trying to build a common sense of belonging between the international working class and trying to see how, let's say one example, gentrification. We see how gentrification causes the displacement of immigrants inside of a country in order to clear up a neighborhood, and how that's connected, let's say, with foreclosing the commons and public spaces. So that's just an idea of how we can see working movements and immigrant groups working together, because we see how all these restructures affect all of these populations and how we need to have the sense of common belonging so we can have reactions when anyone gets attacked by the state.
We're almost out of time, so if you, whatever you guys can take, your closing comments.
Very quickly, like a minute, like a quick minute. So, great point, Nikita, right? So, yeah, I think that's part of the reason for which this model, it's called hydraulic model, but people talk in the migration literature, they talk about push and pull factors and these kinds of things, right? It does sound like a pseudo-scientific kind of thing. That might be part of the sort of stickiness of it, that people like it and sort of gravitate towards it. But when you think about it, it doesn't really explain anything. It just kind of tells you something that happens. It's like, okay, well, these things are always happening. right? So what is the actual explanatory power of this analysis? Yeah, so good point. I think that's part of it, yes. Marie, listen. You know, absolutely. Part of my research was interviewing and talking to Haitian migrants that are not part of the meatpacking industry. Part of my idea of the illegality continuum is that some of these Haitian migrants have legal status, yet they continue to be made to be super exploitable as much as undocumented workers. And that is possible because they don't have the sort of long-standing roots that other migrants have in that particular part of the country. This is North Carolina, where I was mostly focused. So even though they might have a legal status, they lack some of the protections that are essential to be able to not be subject to those kinds of labor exploitations. This is not to say that your position is in any ways race reductionist. Racism is very real, and it functions, and that's how it was made to be, you know, from the very beginning. And we come to see it as a real, natural thing. And the matter of race reductionism is that scholars try to explain anything on the basis of race without looking at how it relates to class. That is the point. It's not that they cannot speak about race or say that racism doesn't exist. Racism very much exists. I am also subjected to it. I feel it. I have felt it. You know, but the point is that race by itself doesn't explain how these other things take place, and to try to allocate too much explanatory power to that factor alone, devoid of, again, my point being earlier about racialized class relations, is that it cannot do a disservice to a larger analysis. That is the sole point of it. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, just one comment on your question. I think in the undocumented workers strikes that happened in France, and I was talking about, there is a collusion between French workers' union and worker migrants. But I would say that the very limit of such a mobilization is that it's only profiting, you know, to the capital and to the employers. And so the negative thing is that such collisions, when they happen, finally they are just nourishing, you know, the force of capital and the power of the state, and the kind of struggles the anarchist collectives were talking about, which will be built, you know, on the principle of reciprocity between citizens and foreigners. Unfortunately, they don't take place, you know. It's some kind of, you know, ideal or political project, but and on the other hand, what a lot of scholars now are denouncing is the fact that even within migrants' mobilization, there is a recreation of some kind of hierarchy, you know, between the citizens who are defending the poor migrants and the migrants themselves who are somehow dispossessed of their agency and of their power of speech. So it's very complicated because even within mobilizations which are favorable, pro-migrants, you know, you see the reconstruction of power relationships and somehow paternalism, you know, between good citizens who would want to protect the foreigners and the foreigners themselves who are invisibilized in this mobilization. And one very good example for me of this in the French, you know, landscape of migrant struggles is that maybe you have heard about Cédric Héroux, who is a a great defender of migrants near the border of Italy, and who has helped a lot of migrants coming from Italy in providing them shelter. But you know, he has been heroized.
It turned into a hero.
Yeah, it turned into a hero by people in France who are pro-migrants. But it's always the French citizen, you know, who becomes the hero of the narrative, and almost never the migrants themselves, because except certain sans-papier leaders who are a little bit famous in certain activist circles, no foreigner gets the attention and mediatization like Cédric Héroux, who is a French citizen. So it's also very interesting to see how the mediatization process around migrants' mobilization is again reproducing the domination, you know, of citizen in the narrative, and excluding the foreigners themselves who are struggling for their rights.
Well, thank you so much. It's unfortunate that we're out of time, but let's again thank Clara. The wonderful questions as always.
Thank you, everybody.